This was 100% preventable.
Today in Austin,
my baby girl is still missing.
Parents who lost daughters when floods destroyed Camp Mystic pouring out their hearts and demanding action. 27 girls were killed. The mother of Seal Stewart, the only camper whose body's not been found, saying they were betrayed by camp officials who were unprepared.
Protocols that should have been in place were ignored. As a result, my daughter was stolen from us.
The parents supporting new legislation that would bar licenses for camps that place cabins in floodplains and require camps to conduct evacuation drills.
She was so kind, the most gentle little girl who fiercely loved her little sisters and all of her friends.
Blake and Caitlin Bonner speaking about their beloved 9-year-old daughter, Lila.
Why were our children sleeping in a known high-risk flood zone?
Lawmakers listening, some in tears, passing the bill out of committee as heartbroken parents press on.
What I do know is that my daughter should still be here. We can't let complacency claim the life of another child.
So very sad, so very real, emotions so very raw. They are right. Their children should be alive. Politics are now at play, unfortunately. The blame game. We're going to talk about this and try to decipher what actually happened and what can happen in the future to make sure a disaster like this doesn't happen again. We have on the program Mr. Garrett Fulce, who is a political consultant, contributor, Young Voices. Thank you for being on the show. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me today.
Thank you for being here again. I don't know what you believe contributed to this. I do want to have your review fully on record as you see it, and then I will respond and we'll chop it up.
Sure. I think there are a couple of things to look at here beyond just what happened in this particular instance, right? Texas floods. We have like an incredible amount of reservoirs and lakes in this state that are not natural. They're all there for flood prevention and for drinking water. So there's always going to be flooding in Texas. It's either drought or it's flood. And there are these areas in the hill country with where the rocks are, a lot of valleys and whatever else, where you have these very fast moving floods that can happen when a storm just sits on the area and dumps water. It usually happens from tropical weather events. It happens every few years. It just kind of moves around, and it's happened in this area. This is now the third time in the past 100 years. So this is a known problem to have happened, not just in Texas, not just in that area, but in Texas as a whole. So there are any number of policies that should have been in place. There should have been sirens on the river. There should have been better warning systems. They relied on cell warnings that reached people too late regardless, but it was 2 o'clock in the morning to 4 o'clock in the morning. People were asleep. People have turned off the warnings because they've been alerted to all sorts of things and woken up in the middle of the night over the past year to things that were not emergencies. So any number of people just did not have the time. And then in particular, these summer camps, well, you did not have evacuation plans. They had been exempted from all sorts of like daycare-like provisions in the state. And they've now passed legislation, thankfully, where they're going to be treated more like a daycare and regulated as such, where they're going to have these plans in place to go forward so that the counselors we call them counselors, they are adults, they're 17, 18-year-old kids too. And they were told to sit in place so that was the plan, just, wait it out. But when the 30 feet of water come rushing at you, you need to get running it out of the way.
Yeah, and listen, I agree completely with your assessment, and we're going to try to do something here that's unique. We're going to try to talk about policy without talking about the partisan nature of the policy. I could wax poetic about Trump administration, Texas regulatory or deregulatory standards, et cetera. But let's talk about it from a very commonsensical view. If you have children that frequent a location, that location should have a regulatory standard that is comparable to the protection of children. You and I would agree on that, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. There's a sentiment in conservative and in some moderate Democratic circles that will say, well, we need deregulation in order for these individuals to be able to operate a business in this particular area, this particular industry. And what happens if we just blindly accept these things on partisan value rather than really go into the meat of what it means, we get a disaster like this. Because much of this could have been resolved based on a few rules or standards being in place policy-wise prior to the event. Would you agree or disagree with that sentiment?
I think you're on track. I think we're agreeing so far.
Okay. So now you have the disaster. You have some regulation happening. State legislation is being applied. Unfortunately, it took some dead children in order for people to kind of snap back to common sense. My heart goes out to these parents, man, because regardless of what they believe politically or what their affiliation may have been, their baby should be alive, in my humble opinion. And you have this convergence of policy that didn't protect and then response mechanisms that were inadequate at best after the fact. And it created this storm that we have today. What say you to that?
I think that anytime you have the death of a child and something that is foreseeable, there should be punishment to at least the entity responsible. In Texas, the government owns all the public waters in the state. They benefit from the tax revenue generated from having lakes and rivers and coastline, and having the increased property values near it. They benefit from the tourism going to this area with people spending more money and having the tax dollars from that, right? You have all of these funding sources that are coming into the state and into the local governments, where the people who are near a tourist area should have the peace of mind to know that a crazy event should not just kill their whole families. And when that does happen, the governments themselves should be held responsible. But we don't allow that. There's a thing called sovereign immunity, I'm sure you're very aware of, that the government has to allow itself to be sued. And I've been talking about things talking about an idea where the government should start peeling back these areas when there is something where it is foreseeable, where there should have been some sort of government intervention beforehand. I mean, because that they should be held responsible. Because there is going to be events like tornadoes you cannot predict. Like if a tornado hits something, you can't do anything about it. But 3 floods in the same area in 100 years, you should have sirens. You should have alert systems. You should not let people build in the floodway, not even the floodplain. That's a discussion for engineers, but the floodway is where it's going to flood every time. You shouldn't have buildings there where 7-year-olds sleep. So that's where my solution or my idea for how to prevent not just this particular type of tragedy again in the future, but other types of tragedies in the future. Because if the government and the entities responsible have skin in the game, they're going to be more proactive in looking for solutions to get the problem fixed.
Garrett, you make a great point. In law school, I learned something called foreseeability. And that's what you're talking about. And if you engage in an action and it is reasonably foreseeable that this disaster can happen, guess what? The law says you're responsible. You're responsible because of the dynamic doctrine known as foreseeability. However, the government, who, by the way, holds you accountable to that doctrine, is not itself held accountable to the foreseeability doctrine. Isn't that ironic? And so even if the government can foresee that these things will happen, they must allow themselves to be accountable rather than forced accountability. And I don't think, dear brother, that that's true accountability when you have to volunteer accountability rather than be held accountable due to your either ineffectiveness or your negligence or sometimes your maliciousness as it relates to the policy or the standard at play. So now you have this. There's an argument to be made that governments have too many protections. And if you start to peel back some of those protections, you may get a more accountable government. Is that the argument I hear you making?
Yes, sir. But I do think that if you look at, yes, because there is many things that are just broken. They're
Yes,
broken in our
but
system.
you know that argument
we
that
know
you're
they
making, that's adverse to many of the traditional arguments made by conservatives as it relates to any kind of disaster. It could be flood disaster, it could be a mass shooting, it could be police brutality. That typically the Republican or the conservative point of view is adverse to what you're saying. We would say, hey, peel back qualified immunity so you can get a more accountable governmental entity known as the police agency. While others on the conservative side would say, no, keep qualified immunity in place. You're saying basically, let's peel back these immunity clauses that the government maintains. In the case of this scenario, at least you're saying it. But once again, these things are connected, dear brother. Would you not agree that there's a connection here?
I think that this is a possible solution in any number of areas where our governmental system is broken. I do not necessarily think that this is the only solution that should ever be applied. I do think it is a situation that should be applied in cases where everything else has been exhausted. If we keep having tens and hundreds of people dying, 135 people died that night. If you keep having incidents like that consistently, there has to be some sort of fix that has to happen. Now, I think there's always going to be opportunity for any of the issues you mentioned where I may reflexively say, no, we need to try other things first, where we may get to a point, or you may make the point in a given circumstance where I might come around to saying, yes, we've tried everything. And I'm not very versed on the issues you're talking about, but we've tried everything and we should start peeling this back. And then how you do it's also important. Texas has caps. Texas just did this actually when it comes to child abuse in schools. So there was a bill from the last legislature. It goes into effect in a week or in 4 days, where schools can no longer just say, hey, we did our best, but this guy kept molesting kids and we're not to blame. They can now be held accountable to up to $500,000 per kid. Having a cap on how much an incident can generate in punitive damages is one way to limit the damage to taxpayers, regardless. But also there are things on who loses that immunity, whether it's the entity itself or whether it's individual people. And a lot of times, I think if you were to remove that protection from the government, not necessarily the people within the government, well, the government has to pay more in insurance premiums and whatever else. They're going to start looking at making their policies not be awful. So that's where I
Garrett, that's one way. That's one way. It is interesting to me that the state of Texas has found a way to hold teachers accountable, but they have not found a way to hold negligent cops accountable. So a school system, by law, will have to pay $500,000 per incident, while a police agency would be immune from something very similar happening under their authority. That, to me, is hypocritical. But I want to take it to another obvious point. Here's how you save the taxpayer money, and you don't create a statutory dynamic that would harm the taxpayer. It's called self-preservation. Self-preservation. Instead of making it a civil code, Garrett, make it a personal criminal code, to where the individuals who were aware of such behavior and did not do anything to stop this behavior, that they can be held accountable not only civilly because they have no immunity clause, but they can be held accountable criminally. And that is a way you take the taxpayer out of the automated or automatic statutory requirement, and you put the emphasis where the emphasis should be. Another example, if you hold a position of public trust as a surgeon and you do something that is grossly negligent as a surgeon, it doesn't mean you did it maliciously, but you have a duty of care, a duty of responsibility. Well, guess what happens? You as a surgeon, you are held responsible. and you could be held criminally responsible. Doesn't that make more sense than just creating a blanket statute that gives the offender or the ones who enabled the offense a pass, and the taxpayer pays the bill? Because under the statute of Texas, the individual or individuals who enabled the behavior, they're not criminally penalized.
I want to be clear. I do believe with how it's written, the teacher, or let's say it's the teacher, but it could be a coach, it could be a para, it could be any number of the school official that molests a kid or sexually assaults a child is already criminally liable. They don't have any protection because it's outside of their job duties.
They don't have any protection, but the people who enabled it, brother, we've reported on stories where there's even a law that says if you see something, you got to say something. But we've seen it to where teachers have seen abuse. We've had it where the abuse is recorded. We've played the recording or gave the screenshots. None of the educators are held accountable for it, even though there's a law in the books that says you're supposed to be held accountable.
I look at this new bill, look at 4623 and how it's going to be put into code, because a lot of those protections for those administrators, is particularly the ones like the principals and the supervisors who should have known, and if they have been removed in these situations on top of the $500,000.
No, I get that.
Yes, criminally.
We're back to civil. Will they be criminally charged? And if so, give me the statute that will criminally charge them. What's the new statutory language that gives them?
I don't know. I'm not sure if the statutory language has been published yet, but it came from HB 4623, and I'll try and get it to you so you can look at it.
Okay.
But on top of that, they've also constrained those time periods for mandatory reporters. It's a lot. Before we had like 72 hours or 3 business days or something. They've made it 24 hours, in some cases 40 hours, and
that's
other
progress.
Types of situations.
I can agree with that progress, right? I can agree with that progress all the way. But there's also, and I'm just trying to make all the policy, like if it's good policy for teachers, it got to be good policy for communities. So let's say a bad cop does something in front of an alleged good cop. There's a duty to report. Why don't we have the same policy for the cops? Why don't we have the same policies for watershed management? Why don't we? So the things that protect the community at large, I'm using a proxy argument to show you that if it's good for teachers, dear brother, how can it be bad for the cops? If it's good for teachers, how is it bad for policy that regulates where people build? Why don't we have congruent policy that says we're doing this in protection of our communities at large?
And I think that's an argument that you should continue to make, and bringing up examples of how it's worked. I think a good way to build on your argument would just see if HB 4623 is successful. Same for my argument. If it's a success, then it should work for other things, and we can start figuring out ways to apply it. But at this point, we don't know if it works. But we just know there's a very, very key thing that's happening with, rampant sexual abuse of children by educators and by other folks, but like in that situation. So if it works here, let's see if it works with dirty cops or with any other situations you mentioned, watershed management. That's kind of where I would land on it. I don't think we should do it right away. I think we should see if it works. Let's see if this system works, and let's move from there.
All right, dear brother, I hope to have you back on the program. I'm flat out of time. I appreciate the honest debate about policy and the facts. Thank you for your advocacy and all you do.
Thank you.